They thought humiliating me in front of lenders and executives would make me disappear quietly. They truly believed a woman without a formal title could fire the architect of their entire financial system and still keep the money moving. What they failed to understand was simple. I never built a platform that bowed to power. I built one that obeyed the record, and once they pushed me out, that record started talking. My name is Kayla Mitchell. For the past 8 years, my life has been measured in algorithms, control frameworks, and the quiet, unyielding architecture of financial control. I am 38 years old, and I am the corporate controls architect for Crescent Harbor Systems, an infrastructure finance technology firm based in the freezing glass and steel heart of Denver. It was a Tuesday morning, exactly 8 o'clock, when I stepped out of the elevator and onto the executive floor for the final launch review of Ledger One. The air up here always felt thinner, heavily filtered and smelling faintly of ozone and expensive roasted coffee. Ledger One was not just a piece of software, it was the central nervous system for the entire company. It was a platform I designed from the ground up to control payment approvals across 18 major commercial development projects. We were not moving small sums. The rollout we were finalizing today was tied to nearly $280 million in active disbursements and future financing. I walked into the main boardroom. The sheer mahogany table stretched the length of the room, surrounded by ergonomic leather chairs that cost more than most people made in a month. The room was already packed. It was a dense ecosystem of power and anxiety. There were our internal executives, shifting in their tailored wool suits. There were the project directors, the men who actually oversaw the concrete and steel, looking visibly uncomfortable in business attire. And most importantly, there were the lenders' observers. These were the auditors and risk analysts from the major banks, sent to ensure that their $280 million would not vanish into the ether of mismanagement or fraud. I took my seat near the middle of the table, opening my leather portfolio. I had spent 8 years of my life building the approval logic, the fraud detection ladders, and the strict governance safeguards that kept our vendors, our subcontractors, and our payroll streams clean. In a business where a single misplaced decimal or a deliberately expedited invoice could bleed a project dry, I was the one who built the tourniquets. I was known for being calm, intensely private, and utterly meticulous. I never needed to perform my authority. I never raised my voice. I simply wrote the rules that the money had to follow. I glanced toward the head of the table. Adrian Mercer, our chief executive officer, sat in the center seat. Something was off. Adrian was usually a tight coil of nervous energy before a major launch, barking quiet orders and double-checking metrics. Today, he was leaning back, his hands steepled, a serene, almost lazy smile playing on his lips. He looked unusually relaxed, like a man who had already crossed the finish line. He looked exactly like a man who believed the hardest work was over, and that the people who had actually built his golden machine no longer mattered. Marcus Vance, a senior operations executive with a penchant for using 10 words where one would do, stood at the front of the room beside a massive digital display. He was presenting the final operational readiness report for Ledger One. "What we have achieved here is a fully integrated turnkey governance solution," Marcus said, gesturing smoothly at a flowchart that I had drafted 6 months ago. "Moving forward, the operations team is fully equipped to maintain this ecosystem. We have streamlined the oversight. This is no longer a developmental project. It is a live asset, and our team is ready to steer the ship." I listened to the subtle shift in his vocabulary. He said team. He said our team. He was systematically minimizing my role, taking credit for the polish, the stability, and the impenetrable security of the platform. He painted a picture of a system so perfect that it ran itself, completely erasing the architect who had bled over its code and compliance structures for nearly a decade. I remained outwardly composed. My face betrayed absolutely nothing. I simply nodded slightly, projecting the image of a compliant employee. But beneath the polished surface, my mind was racing, cataloging every discrepancy. I opened the thick, heavy stock executive packet placed at my seat. I flipped past the executive summaries and the risk mitigation charts, heading straight for the legal appendices. My eyes scanned the pages, and a cold knot formed in my stomach. Missing. There were several critical approval transfer forms that were supposed to be finalized before this launch. These were the legal documents that formally shifted the governance authority from the development phase, which was me, to the operational phase, which was them. Without those signed forms, the system still legally recognized me as the primary custodian of record. It was a massive oversight for a launch of this scale. I looked up at Adrian. His relaxed posture suddenly did not look like confidence. It looked like a trap. Why would they rush a launch without the legal transfer of authority? Before I could formulate the question, the heavy oak doors at the back of the boardroom swung open. The rhythmic, sharp click of high heels echoed against the hardwood floor. Every head in the room turned. It was Sabrina Mercer. Adrian's wife was an elegant, socially powerful woman who moved with the practiced grace of someone who expected the world to part for her. She wore a tailored ivory blazer that probably cost more than my first car, her hair perfectly blown out, her expression a mask of supreme entitlement. She was not an employee of Crescent Harbor Systems. She held no title, drew no salary, and had absolutely no legal standing to be in a secure financial launch review. Yet, she walked in as though she owned the building, bypassing the guest chairs lining the walls and striding directly toward the head of the table. The room went dead quiet. The silence was thick, heavy, and deeply uncomfortable. The project directors stared at their legal pads. The internal executives suddenly found the grains in the mahogany table fascinating. I watched the lenders' observers. One of them, a sharp-eyed woman from the primary bank, stiffened, her pen hovering over her notepad. She exchanged a microscopic, alarmed glance with her colleague. This was not the first time Sabrina had inserted herself into company decisions. For the past 2 years, her shadow had been growing over the executive floor. She would suggest vendor changes, critique office layouts, and occasionally dictate marketing strategies. Adrian always permitted it, dressing it up as informal consulting. But she had never crossed this particular line. She had never intruded on a formal, legally binding governance review, and she had certainly never done it in front of the people holding the purse strings to $280 million. Sabrina stopped right beside Adrian's chair. She did not sit. She stood over him, placing a manicured hand on the back of his leather seat, claiming the physical high ground in the room. Adrian did not flinch. He did not look surprised. He did not ask her what she was doing here. He simply looked down at his tablet. In that single fraction of a second, the missing forms, Marcus's speech, Adrian's smug relaxation, and Sabrina's grand entrance all snapped together in my mind like the tumblers of a vault. This was not a spontaneous interruption. She was not dropping by to bring him a file he forgot. This was a choreographed execution. They had gathered the lenders, the executives, and half the company in this room not just to launch Ledger One, but to make a spectacle. It was a staged power move, meticulously timed for maximum humiliation. They wanted to rip the keys from my hands in front of the entire industry, proving that no matter how vital I was to the architecture, I was ultimately just an employee they could discard on a whim. I did not gasp. I did not shrink back in my chair. I sat perfectly straight, my hands folded neatly over my leather portfolio. I looked directly at Sabrina, feeling the cold, cinematic reality of corporate warfare wash over me. They thought I was just a quiet woman who built systems. They were about to find out exactly how deep my architecture really went. Sabrina did not immediately speak. She began a slow, deliberate circuit around the perimeter of the room. The only sound was the sharp, rhythmic strike of her heels against the polished hardwood. As she walked behind the row of seated executives, she trailed her manicured fingers lightly along the backs of their leather chairs. It was a deeply territorial gesture. She was inspecting her domain. She passed the lenders from the primary bank. They stared rigidly at the blank screens of their laptops, instinctively recognizing a domestic corporate dispute and desperately wanting no part in it. She walked past the head of human resources, Evelyn, who suddenly looked as though all the blood had been drained from her face. Finally, Sabrina completed her orbit and came to a halt precisely where she had started, claiming the empty space beside Adrian. She did not pull up a guest chair. Sitting would have put her at eye level with the rest of us. Standing allowed her to look down. "It has become apparent over the last few weeks," Sabrina began, her voice a perfectly modulated hum of faux regret, "that Crescent Harbor Systems is entering a new phase of growth, and with that growth comes the necessity for alignment." She paused, letting the corporate buzzwords settle over the room like a heavy fog. I kept my eyes locked on the digital display at the front of the room, my breathing slow and even. "Leadership has decided," Sabrina continued, her tone sharpening, "that we can no longer tolerate the bottlenecks created by one difficult personality. We need agility. We need team players who understand that the vision of this company supersedes individual egos. We cannot have our payment pipelines held hostage by someone who refuses to adapt to modern operational flows." The words were a direct, unvarnished assassination. She did not say my name, but she did not have to. Every single person in that room knew exactly who the architect of the payment pipeline was. Evelyn from Human Resources froze completely. I could see her hands trembling slightly against her legal pad. Evelyn knew the terrifying reality of this moment better than anyone. There was no formal performance review on file for me. There had been no progressive discipline. No internal process had been initiated, let alone followed. And most damning of all, the woman currently delivering this verdict possessed exactly zero legal authority to terminate an employee, let alone a senior governance architect. Yet, no one stopped her. The room was paralyzed by the sheer, brazen irregularity of the spectacle. Sabrina must have anticipated the unspoken question of her authority. With a fluid, almost theatrical motion, she reached across the table and picked up Adrian's phone. The device had been sitting face up next to his coffee cup. She tapped the screen, unlocked it, and dropped it back onto the center of the mahogany table, sliding it forward just enough so that the executive seated nearest to the center could see the glowing display. "For those concerned about protocol," Sabrina said smoothly, "Adrian and I discussed this at length this morning. We are in complete agreement." I did not need to crane my neck to see the screen. I could guess the contents. It was a text thread, a casual message from the chief executive officer of a major infrastructure firm, giving his wife permission to act as his executioner. I learned later that the text simply read to handle Kayla today and to do whatever she thought was best. It was a legally meaningless document, a personal message weaponized in a professional setting. But in that room, it provided just enough plausible cover. It gave the executives an excuse to stare at their hands. It gave human resources the momentary paralysis they needed to avoid intervening. It was the illusion of a mandate. I shifted my gaze from Sabrina to Adrian. This was the moment of truth. If he had a shred of leadership, a fraction of professional integrity, he would have spoken up. He could have stopped the circus, asked Sabrina to step outside, and handled my termination behind closed doors like a standard executive transition. Instead, Adrian said absolutely nothing. He kept his eyes fixed on a spot on the far wall, a studied expression of neutral observation on his face. He refused to look at me. That silence landed harder than if he had stood up and screamed at me himself. It was a profound, sickening cowardice. He wanted me gone because I refused to bend the rules for his preferred vendors, but he lacked the spine to fire me to my face. He was perfectly willing to let his wife publicly dismantle my career, right in front of the people who held our funding, as long as his own hands appeared clean. "Therefore," Sabrina announced, her voice rising to fill the dead air, "effective immediately, Kayla Mitchell is removed from the Ledger One launch. She is removed from the executive floor. Kim? And she is stripped of all financial control responsibilities. Security has already been notified to pack her desk." The sheer brutality of the statement hung in the air. In front of my colleagues, my subordinates, and external financial monitors, I was being treated like a corporate spy caught stealing secrets. It was designed to shatter me. It was designed to make me cry, to make me shout, to make me beg for my dignity so they could point to my emotional reaction as proof that I was exactly the difficult, unstable personality they claimed I was. A nervous cough broke the silence. It was David, a senior risk analyst sitting near the end of the table. He looked terrified to be speaking, but the compliance drilled into him forced his mouth open. "Excuse me," David murmured, his voice cracking slightly. "But regarding the governance transition, has the platform's administrative authority already been legally transferred to operations? The active disbursement windows open in less than 2 hours." Sabrina waved her hand dismissively, cutting him off before he could finish his thought. "David, please, let us not get bogged down in technical drama. Marcus and his team have the system fully under control. We are not going to let administrative paperwork delay a $280 million rollout." She called the legal foundation of our entire financial safeguard system technical drama. The profound ignorance of that statement was staggering. She truly believed that because the software had a clean, user-friendly interface, the underlying legal architecture no longer mattered. I knew, in that exact second, that I had won. They were pushing me out of the airplane, but I was the only one wearing a parachute. I did not argue. I did not demand to speak to human resources. I did not shed a single tear. The cold, logical part of my brain, the part that wrote the compliance algorithms they so desperately hated, took complete control. I slowly closed my leather portfolio. The soft click of the magnetic clasp sounded unusually loud in the silent room. I stood up, smoothing the front of my skirt. I reached up and unclipped the hard plastic security badge from my lapel. I placed the badge flat on the mahogany table. I did not toss it. I did not slam it. I set it down with the gentle, deliberate care of someone placing a loaded weapon on a desk. The absolute absence of anger unsettled the room far more than a screaming match ever could have. The executives who had expected a meltdown looked confused, their eyes darting between my calm face and the plastic badge. I picked up my portfolio and tucked it under my arm. I looked directly at Adrian, forcing him to finally meet my eyes. He looked away after less than a second. Then, I looked at Sabrina. Her triumphant smile faltered slightly. Unsure of how to process my total lack of surrender, I pushed my chair in, making sure it was perfectly aligned with the edge of the table. I turned toward the heavy oak doors, taking 3 measured steps before pausing. I looked back over my shoulder, sweeping my gaze across the lenders, the terrified risk analysts, and finally, the smug executives. "Then whoever signs the next payment batch," I said, my voice quiet, flat, and carrying to every corner of the room, "should make sure the system still recognizes the company's authority." I did not wait to see their faces register the warning. I walked out of the boardroom, the doors sealing shut behind me with a heavy final thud. I stepped out of the glass doors of the Crescent Harbor Systems building exactly 9 minutes after placing my badge on the mahogany table. The morning air was sharp and thin, biting at my wrists, but I did not pull my coat tighter. I walked to the corner cafe, ordered a black coffee, and took a seat by the window facing the plaza. I did not need to be inside the executive suite to know exactly what was happening. I knew the architecture of Ledger One better than I knew the back of my own hand. I had spent 8 years writing the compliance logic, anticipating every conceivable failure point, including rogue executive action. I knew that right at that moment, the platform was waking up to a severed connection. I would learn later from the server logs, the desperate internal emails, and the sworn deposition transcripts exactly how the collapse unfolded. Ledger One did not fail in a chaotic, cinematic shower of sparks or fragmented error screens. A crash would imply broken code or a server overload. What happened was far more dangerous because it was deliberate, perfectly executed, and legally binding. At precisely 9:15 in the morning, less than 10 minutes after my exit, the system entered a state of governance review hold. The heavy machinery of our payment pipeline simply ground to a silent, immutable halt. Large subcontractor payment batches, some totaling over $4 million, stopped moving through the clearing queues. Vendor releases stalled at the final verification step. Across 18 different commercial development sites, payroll approvals shifted from active to a restricted state. Every single blocked transaction was flagged with a single status code indicating it was pending a verified authority transfer. Up on the executive floor, the finance team initially assumed it was a routine permission sync issue. Marcus Vance and his operations team likely told everyone to refresh their dashboards, expecting the green indicator lights to blink back on within seconds. They spent the first 15 minutes treating it like a standard software hiccup, a minor inconvenience on launch day. That delusion lasted right up until the first lender monitoring alert appeared. This alert did not pop up on an internal information technology dashboard where it could be quietly dismissed because Ledger 1 was directly tied to the financing covenants. The alert bypassed operations entirely. It flashed directly onto the screens of the Treasury directors and, disastrously, onto the laptops of the lender representatives who were still sitting at the mahogany boardroom table. The alert was automatically triggered by a critical, unresolvable error. Unresolved custodian of record conflict. Panic is a slow burn in corporate finance, but when it ignites, it consumes everything. The Treasury team immediately tried to push a manual override. They logged in with high-level executive credentials, attempting to force the stalled batches through the payment gates to save face in front of the banks. But Ledger 1 was not built to respect a fancy job title or a corner office. It was built to respect the chain of custody. The system rejected every single attempt. It threw up a cold, gray dialog box explaining that the registered architecture custodian had been disconnected from the network, and absolutely no valid succession certificate had been logged into the compliance ledger. Without my secure digital signature authorizing a legal handover, the system viewed any attempt to move money as a potential hostile breach of fiduciary duty. By 9:45, the phones began to ring. It started in the operations department. Field supervisors from the Denver Transit Hub project and the downtown high-rise developments were calling in, their voices tight with anger and confusion. Their crews could not be cleared for heavy equipment rentals. Deliveries of structural steel were being held at the security gates because the material release payments were bouncing back as unauthorized. Milestone payments meant to clear at 10 o'clock sharp were completely frozen. A foreman from a site 200 miles away screamed at a junior clerk that he had 80 men standing around doing absolutely nothing because the daily payroll escrow had not been funded. Back in the boardroom, the polished facade finally shattered. Sabrina Mercer was the first to lose her composure. She stood at the head of the table, jabbing her manicured finger at the lead engineers who had been summoned to the room, accusing them of gross incompetence. "Fix it right now," Sabrina demanded, her voice shrill and echoing off the walls. "You are supposed to be the technical experts. Override the lock." When the terrified engineers showed her the screen, explaining that the system was intentionally locking them out due to a missing custodian credential, she pivoted instantly. "She booby-trapped it," Sabrina snapped, glaring at the empty chair where I had been sitting. "Kayla set a trap on her way out purely out of ego. She is trying to sabotage the launch because she could not handle being managed." She demanded they fire whoever wrote the fail-safe code, completely missing the profound irony that the fail-safe code was the only reason the banks had agreed to lend them $280 million in the first place. Robert, the general counsel, was the only executive not yelling. He had pulled up the full text of the hold notice on his tablet. The color drained completely from his face as he read the specific legal clause cited by the system lock. He looked across the table at the lender representatives, who were suddenly furiously typing on their keyboards, drafting emergency notices to their risk departments. Robert realized the catastrophic truth. The platform was not malfunctioning. It was behaving exactly as required under Crescent Harbor's strict financing covenants. The primary lending bank had mandated a secure independent custodian structure to prevent executive embezzlement or unauthorized fund diversion. Sabrina had just publicly, and without a shred of lawful authorization, severed that custodian. Adrian finally tried to seize control of the room. He stood up, barking out a rapid-fire series of commands. His calm demeanor entirely evaporated. "Force the approvals through the secondary server," Adrian ordered, pointing at the operations director. "Reroute the payroll ledgers to the manual accounts. Get the banking liaison on the phone and tell them we are executing a standard security patch. But every order he gave only deepened the hole he was digging. The engineers stared at him in sheer disbelief. The secondary servers were locked down by the same covenant logic. Manual accounts could not process union payroll without a certified ledger match. The more commands he gave, the more agonizingly obvious it became to everyone in the room that the chief executive officer did not actually understand the safeguards he had spent 2 years marketing to his investors. He thought it was a technical glitch. He did not realize it was a fundamental breach of contract. Then, the second wave of holds hit. At exactly 10:15, recognizing that the primary custodian was still missing and unauthorized attempts were repeatedly being made to breach the payment gates, Ledger 1 automatically escalated the lockdown. It froze the secondary operating accounts to protect the capital reserves. The massive digital display at the front of the boardroom flashed from a neutral gray to a stark, warning red. The room fell into a stunned, breathless silence. The sheer, terrifying scale of the disaster finally settled over the executive team. The company realized, with a collective, sinking dread, that this was not a software outage that could be fixed with a quick reboot or a threatening phone call to the information technology department. It was a full-scale governance crisis. It carried immediate legal, financial, and reputational consequences that threatened to collapse their entire portfolio by the end of the business day. They had wanted to remove the difficult woman. They had succeeded, and now, the vault was sealed from the inside. I left the coffee shop and walked toward the small, concrete park adjacent to the corporate plaza. The Denver wind was sharp, cutting straight through the heavy wool of my coat, but I welcomed the bitter cold. It was grounding, it was real. For the first time since I stepped onto the executive floor that morning, I finally let my shoulders drop. I exhaled a long, shuddering breath that plumed white in the freezing air. I had survived the theatrical public execution. Now came the quiet war. Before I could even begin to process the sheer, suffocating humiliation of being escorted out of a building I had practically wired together, my phone vibrated deep in my pocket. I pulled it out and stared at the glowing screen. Adrian Mercer. He had not waited even 45 minutes. I swiped the screen and lifted the phone to my ear, saying absolutely nothing. "Kayla," Adrian said. His voice was smooth, carrying the polished menace of a man who firmly believed that any career could be quietly buried if he simply applied the right amount of pressure. He did not sound angry. He sounded like a disappointed parent. "I hope you have had a moment to cool down. I want to make sure you do not misread the situation." "I am not misreading anything, Adrian," I replied, my voice perfectly flat. "Listen to me," he continued, slipping into the practiced cadence he used during tough vendor negotiations. What happened in that room was unfortunate optics. Sabrina is passionate about the company culture, and perhaps her delivery was not ideal, but you have to admit, you have been difficult lately. You have been rigid. You built a wonderful system, but you were never as essential to the daily operations as you thought you were. The team is fully capable of taking it from here. He was trying to rewrite history in real time. He was framing a fundamental, legally catastrophic governance breach as a mere personality conflict. "The industry is very small, Kayla," Adrian warned, his tone dropping a fraction of an octave, shifting from negotiation to a veiled threat. "People talk. We do not want a situation where a difficult personality becomes completely unemployable because she decided to throw a tantrum on her way out the door. We are prepared to offer you a very generous severance package. 6 months of salary, full health coverage, and a neutral reference. All we require is your signature on a standard non-disclosure agreement and a quiet exit before outside parties get unnecessarily involved." He wanted silence. He wanted me to take a check and vanish before the lenders demanded an explanation for why the architect of their security had been thrown out onto the street. I did not argue. I did not defend my personality or my work ethic. I let his threat hang in the cold air for 3 full seconds before I spoke. "Are you asking me to sign a severance agreement, Adrian?" I asked slowly. "Or are you asking me to state in writing that the governance transfer this morning was legally valid?" There was a pause on the line. It was not a long pause. It was perhaps one single second. But in the world of corporate compliance, a 1-second hesitation is a full confession. He hesitated for just a fraction too long because he suddenly realized I knew exactly what was happening inside that building. "We just want to finalize the paperwork," Adrian finally said, his smooth veneer cracking just slightly. "We need to close out your employment file. I will have my attorney review whatever you send," I said, and ended the call. That brief, heavy hesitation told me everything I needed to know. They did not need me gone because of my attitude. They did not care about bottlenecks or my supposed ego. They needed my signature. Or, failing that, they desperately needed my terrified silence before the mandatory audits deepened and the bank started asking questions. I walked to an empty wooden bench, wiped away a thin layer of frost, and sat down. My hands were shaking, not from the cold, but from the massive surge of adrenaline. I opened my contacts and dialed a number I had saved exactly 2 years ago. Mara Duval picked up on the second ring. Mara was an employment and corporate governance attorney. We had crossed paths during a grueling compliance seminar in Chicago, and she was the one who had quietly warned me over drinks that Sabrina Mercer's growing, unchecked access to executive decisions would eventually become a massive liability. Mara possessed a brilliant, ruthless legal mind, and she did not waste time with pleasantries. "Tell me you did not sign anything," Mara said the moment she answered. "I did not sign anything. I just got fired in the middle of the Ledger One launch review, in front of the primary lenders." "Who actually fired you?" Mara asked, her voice instantly dropping into a sharp clinical register. "Sabrina Mercer." She walked in, declared I was a bottleneck, and showed the room a text message from Adrian telling her to handle me. Mara let out a low, dry laugh. "A text message. Outstanding. They just handed you the hammer. Kayla. Now listen to me very carefully. Do not touch any company systems. Do not try to log in from your phone. Do not send an angry email to human resources. Do not do a single thing that they can frame as retaliation or unauthorized access. I am locked out anyway," I told her. But I did not transfer the administrative authority before I left. The system is still legally bound to my credentials. "Good," Mara said, the satisfaction evident in her voice. "Do not panic when they try to threaten you. Adrian is going to realize very soon that he cannot just bully his way past a financing covenant. Do not underestimate how much the financing side will care once the formal hold notices start landing on their desks. The banks do not care about Adrian's marital dynamics. They care about their $280 million. Where are you right now?" "Sitting on a bench outside the building." "Go home. Lock your doors. Do not answer any calls from Crescent Harbor unless it is their legal counsel, and even then, route them directly to me. We are going to let them bleed out in the panic for the next 24 hours. I thanked her and ended the call. The cold was finally starting to numb my fingers, but my mind was burning with a sudden, sharp clarity. I opened the thick leather portfolio I had carried out of the boardroom. Inside was my personal notebook. It was a physical ledger I kept, written entirely in pen, documenting every anomalous request and irregular directive I received. In a digital world where emails could be deleted and server logs could be mysteriously wiped, ink on paper was an immovable anchor. I flipped past the technical diagrams and the meeting minutes, going back over the entries from the last 3 months. I stopped on a page dated the 12th of October. My handwriting laid out a direct request from Adrian's office. His chief of staff had asked me to loosen the exception rules within the platform for a specific list of vendors. They called them executive priority vendors. The request asked me to bypass the standard multi-party sign-off for these specific accounts, allowing their invoices to clear with only a single, low-level administrative approval. I turned the page. The 22nd of October. Another request, this time from the Treasury Director, repeating the same demand for the same subset of vendors. I turned another page. The 3rd of November. A direct email from Adrian, asking why a particular consulting firm was facing payment delays, heavily implying that I needed to manually push the check through the security gates. On every single occasion, I had carefully documented the request, cited the specific board-approved governance policy that prohibited such a bypass, and formally refused to alter the system architecture. I had built the walls too high, and I had refused to install a back door. I stared at the pages as the pieces rapidly snapped together. The public firing was brutal, yes, but it was not merely an impulsive act of cruelty orchestrated by a CEO's wife with a superiority complex. It was a calculated, desperate surgical strike. They had timed it for the exact morning of the launch, hoping the chaotic transition of a $280 million system would mask the administrative blind spot. They thought that by removing me in front of the lenders, they would establish an unquestionable narrative of incompetence, making my sudden disappearance look like necessary corporate hygiene. I closed the notebook. This was never about my ego. This was never about my supposed inability to be a team player. They had fired me to remove the one-person position to stop a much bigger financial exposure. They were bleeding money through those executive priority vendors, and Ledger One was about to lock the doors on their entire operation. They thought they were burying a difficult employee, but they had actually just handed me the shovel to unearth their entire scheme. I sat across from Mara Duval in her downtown office early Wednesday morning, watching her type with terrifying speed. The adrenaline of the previous day had faded, replaced by a cold, methodical focus. Our first move was not to file a wrongful termination lawsuit. That would have been too small, too easily buried in standard corporate arbitration. Instead, Mara helped me draft a formal preservation notice. We addressed the document directly to Naomi Hargrove, the chair of the board of directors, copying the primary monitoring lender and Crescent Harbor's internal corporate counsel. The notice demanded the immediate freezing and preservation of all server logs, communication archives, and payment histories spanning the last 18 months. It was a legal tripwire designed to drop a steel cage around the evidence before Adrian could order his information technology team to start scrubbing servers. Adrian was a man who believed he could rewrite reality through sheer force of will. But he had fundamentally misunderstood the machine he was running. Because Ledger One governed hundreds of millions of dollars in external capital, it was contractually designed to mirror critical governance logs to a neutral, third-party monitoring archive every single night at exactly midnight. Adrian could delete whatever he wanted from the servers in Denver, but the lending bank in New York already possessed the raw, unaltered data. By Thursday afternoon, Mara's contacts within the lending syndicate began to whisper. A preliminary forensic review had been triggered the moment my system hold paralyzed the accounts, and the analysts were already pulling the mirrored data. What they found was not a glitch, it was a pattern. Mara printed out a secure spreadsheet the lender's risk team had forwarded, laying the pages flat on her glass desk. "Look at the timestamps," Mara said, pointing the tip of her pen at a column of cleared payments. "And look at the authorization tags." I leaned over the document. My eyes scanned the rows, quickly identifying the anomaly. There was a dense cluster of payment approvals stamped at 1 in the morning, 2 in the morning, and sometimes even 3 in the morning. Every single one of these late-night transactions carried an executive exception tag. But it was the amounts that made my blood run cold. Under Crescent Harbor's board-approved policy, any vendor payment exceeding $50,000 automatically required a secondary sign-off from a project director and a final compliance verification from my office. The payments on the spreadsheet were chillingly precise. $49,500, $49,800, $48,999. Someone was deliberately bleeding capital out of the company in increments designed to slide just beneath the multi-party sign-off threshold. They were bypassing the heavy vault doors and slipping out through the administrative windows. "Who is the beneficiary?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Mara flipped to the second page. "That is where it gets interesting. These are not subcontractors pouring concrete or laying steel. Several of these rushed. Late-night payments point toward a single vendor, Maison Aurel Studio." I stared at the name. It felt completely out of place in a ledger dedicated to heavy infrastructure and commercial development. Maison Aurel is a design and brand consulting firm, I said, my mind racing. We build transit hubs and commercial towers. We do not need boutique branding consultants, and we certainly do not need to pay them $50,000 at 2 in the morning. I closed my eyes, searching my memory for where I had seen that name before. It had not been on a vendor requisition form. It had been on a heavy cream-colored envelope that arrived at my desk last December. It was an invitation to an exclusive holiday charity gala. The host committee had been prominently listed in gold foil. Sabrina Mercer had been the chairwoman. And the event had been sponsored and produced by her private lifestyle collective, an entity managed entirely by Maison Aurel Studio. A cold shock washed over me, settling deep in my chest. Maison Aurel was quietly tied to Sabrina's private business world. They were using legitimate construction capital to fund her personal empire. Before I could articulate the sheer scale of the fraud, Mara's office phone rang. She answered, listened for a moment, and pressed a button to transfer the call to the secure speakerphone on her desk. "You are on a secure line," Mara said. "Kayla Mitchell is here with me." "Thank God," a trembling voice replied. It was Lila Torres, an accounts payable manager who sat 2 floors below the executive suite. Lila was a meticulous, hard-working woman who usually avoided office politics at all costs. She sounded absolutely terrified. "Lila, what is going on?" I asked gently. "I saw the preservation notice hit the internal legal server," Lila said, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper, as if someone might hear her through the walls. "I had to call you. I cannot hold on to this anymore. They have been pressuring me for months." "Who has been pressuring you?" Mara asked, her pen hovering over a fresh legal pad. "Adrian's chief of staff, mostly. But the orders came from higher up," Lila explained, her words spilling out in a panicked rush. "They made me split the invoices. If Maison Aurel sent a bill for $150,000 for consulting fees, I was told to reject it and have them submit 3 separate invoices for under $50,000 each. They told me it was just to clear the accounting queue faster so the vendors would not complain." "Did you ever question the relabeling of the services?" I asked, looking down at the spreadsheet. "I tried," Lila confessed, her voice thick with unshed tears. "I asked why we were paying for event logistics out of the downtown high-rise budget. I was told to code them as site community engagement and mind my own business." "But Kayla, it was not just the internal staff. She was there." "Who was there?" Mara pressed. "Sabrina," Lila breathed out. "She started showing up at the vendor dinners a few months ago. She would sit right next to Adrian. She was the one who recommended which firms we should use for the soft costs. She would look right at me across the table and tell me which firms needed to be taken care of first. She spoke like she was the one running the company. She spoke as if she had direct authority from Adrian, and he never corrected her." We listened as Lila described a shadow governance structure, one where the chief executive officer's wife effectively controlled the disbursement of millions of dollars to her preferred network, completely bypassing the secure architecture I had spent years building. We assured Lila she would be protected, and Mara immediately drafted an addendum to our file, labeling her as a protected whistleblower. The final twist landed an hour later, arriving in the form of a forwarded email from a paralegal contact of Mara's who worked adjacent to Crescent Harbor's internal counsel. Robert, the general counsel, had spent his morning desperately reviewing the original financing covenants, trying to find a loophole to unlock the frozen funds. Instead of a loophole, he had uncovered a ticking time bomb. During the initial funding rounds 2 years ago, the banks had expressed deep concern about corporate nepotism. To secure the $280 million package, Adrian had signed a binding, sworn addendum. He had assured the lenders in writing that absolutely no family member would participate in any operational governance, vendor selection, or financial controls due to strict conflict of interest concerns. I sat back in my chair, the entire picture finally snapping into perfect, devastating focus. The humiliation in the boardroom had never been about my personality. It was not a reckless, spontaneous power trip by an overbearing wife. It was the frantic, desperate cover-up stage of a long-running scheme. They had been routing money through favored channels using false certifications for months. My system was beginning to flag the split invoices, so they had to remove me before I found the leak. They staged the firing to look like a dramatic human resources dispute, hoping the noise of an executive tantrum would distract everyone from the quiet. Systematic theft happening in the background. They thought they had silenced me, but they had only given me the map to their destruction. It was exactly 48 hours after my badge hit the mahogany table when Naomi Hargrove summoned me back. Naomi, the chair of the board of directors, did not call to apologize. She did not ask me to come save the company out of some misplaced sense of corporate family or loyalty. She operated purely on the cold mathematics of risk and legal exposure. Through a direct special committee mandate, the board brought me back for one specific reason. They desperately needed a clean, uncompromised custodian to separate the valid payments from the suspect ones before the federal regulators or the lending syndicates decided to take hostile action. Walking back through the revolving glass doors of Crescent Harbor Systems felt entirely different. 3 days ago, I was marched out under the smirks of ambitious executives who thought they had finally won. Today, the massive lobby was suffocatingly silent as I crossed the polished marble floor. Whispers replaced the smirks. People who had conveniently ignored my existence for 8 years suddenly stepped completely out of my way, pressing their backs against the elevator walls to give me space. Power had shifted, not because I had demanded it with a loud voice, but because the architecture I had built demanded it through absolute, unyielding procedure. I entered the central command room on the 22nd floor. The room was a nerve center of massive digital displays and server monitors. Adrian stood near the primary terminal, his custom-tailored suit looking slightly rumpled, his face drawn and exhausted. He saw me walk in with my attorney, Mara, and immediately tried to project an air of weary, magnanimous command. "Thank you for being reasonable and coming back, Kayla," Adrian said, gesturing toward the main keyboard. "Let us get the primary streams back online so we can tell the lenders this crisis is completely over." He expected me to sit down, type in my administrative credentials, and unlock the entire $280 million payment pipeline. He wanted the money flowing so he could wash away the evidence of his wife's interference in a flood of normalized operations. "I am not unlocking the full stream, Adrian," I replied calmly, setting my leather portfolio down on the steel desk. "I am not legally authorized to do so until the governance chain is formally repaired and verified by the board of directors." He stared at me, his jaw tightening, the polished facade cracking just a little more. "We have construction crews walking off our sites right now. You are going to restore the system this instant." "I will restore verified payroll," I told him, logging into the restricted custodian interface. "I will release legitimate, field-critical payments for heavy equipment, raw steel, and concrete. Innocent iron workers and electricians will not be collateral damage for a catastrophic management error. But every single discretionary vendor channel, every consulting fee, and every executive exception lane remains frozen pending the special committee review." I typed my credentials and authorized the clean batch. A wave of green indicators washed across the left side of the massive digital wall, signaling that payroll was moving again. But the right side of the screen, the side that governed the boutique consultants and the shadowy brand management firms, remained a glaring, solid red. The color completely drained from the faces of the 2 finance vice presidents standing behind Adrian. They knew exactly what I was leaving locked inside the vault. They had prayed that a rapid system restoration would bury the evidence of their manipulated invoices, but I was freezing their crimes in digital amber. Naomi Hargrove walked into the command room, flanked by outside legal counsel and the lead systems engineer. Naomi did not look at Adrian. She directed her attention entirely to the engineer. "Confirm the failure cascade for the record," Naomi instructed, her voice devoid of any emotion. The engineer, a young man who had been visibly terrified of Sabrina just 3 days ago, stood remarkably straight. "There was no failure, Madam Chair," he stated clearly, his voice carrying across the silent room. Ledger 1 did not malfunction at any point. The engineering team has conducted a full diagnostic. The system flagged an unresolved governance contamination when the primary custodian was forcibly disconnected. It executed a defensive lockdown exactly as designed under the board-approved financial policy. It protected the capital. Just as the engineer finished speaking, a sharp commotion broke out beyond the heavy glass walls of the command room. I turned to see Sabrina Mercer trying to push past the security detail at the reinforced double doors. She was furious, waving her designer handbag, demanding entry to a room she felt she inherently owned by right of marriage. A large security officer held up a flat hand, physically blocking her path. "I need to speak to my husband right now," Sabrina demanded, her voice muffled but distinct through the heavy glass partition. "Ma'am, this is a restricted operational zone," the officer replied, his voice booming through the slightly open door. "You are not an employee of Crescent Harbor Systems. You do not have an active security clearance." For 2 years, Sabrina had floated through this building on the sheer intimidation of her husband's title. She had dictated terms, fired vendors, and reshaped the corporate culture. Now, stripped of the illusion of authority, she was just a civilian being denied entry to a secure facility by a man making $20 an hour. She looked through the glass, locking eyes with me. There was no defiance left in her face. There was only a sudden, profound humiliation that cut far deeper than anything she had inflicted on me in the boardroom. She had tried to humiliate me by taking my job, but I was humiliating her by simply enforcing the reality that she never had one. She turned and walked away, her heels clicking rapidly in a frantic retreat. Naomi turned her attention back to Adrian, her expression turning into a mask of pure ice. "Adrian, the special committee has concluded its preliminary review of the system logs and the witness statements. We are no longer investigating a technical interruption." Adrian swallowed hard, trying desperately to maintain eye contact with the chairwoman. "It was an unfortunate miscommunication regarding the launch protocol. Emotions ran high. It was the retaliatory removal of a legal control custodian during a live financial cycle," Naomi corrected him, her voice slicing cleanly through his desperate corporate doublespeak. "You allowed an unauthorized individual to terminate the primary architect of our payment governance." "She had my proxy," Adrian argued, his voice rising in panic. "I authorized her to handle a personnel issue." "Did you?" Naomi asked, signaling to the outside counsel. The lawyer stepped forward and placed a printed transcript face up on the steel desk. It was the digital forensics report, pulled directly from Adrian's mobile device during the mandatory legal discovery hold. "We subpoenaed the device logs. The message you claim was a formal directive was nothing of the sort." I looked down at the transcript. It was the exact text thread Sabrina had weaponized on the mahogany table to paralyze human resources. It did not authorize a termination. It did not order the revocation of my system access. It was a vague, frustrated message sent late the previous night. It simply read that I was being impossible about the vendor queues again, and he told her to just handle her tomorrow. Sabrina had taken a vague personal complaint and spun it into a theatrical corporate execution in front of witnesses, assuming her proximity to power would shield her from consequence. In that singular, devastating moment, I realized exactly how the power dynamics had shifted. Adrian's vulnerability was no longer just his wife's catastrophic overreach. Even if Sabrina had acted entirely on her own in that boardroom, driven by her own bottomless ego, Adrian had made a fatal choice immediately afterward. He had stood in silence while she dismantled the company's security. He had called me outside the building and tried to buy my complicity with a severance package. He had actively participated in the cover-up of her unauthorized actions, permanently fusing his fate to hers. The trap had not just caught the thief, it had caught the man holding the door open. The counterattack began quietly, exactly as Mara had predicted it would. Adrian still had loyalists embedded throughout the executive floor. Men and women whose own annual bonuses and career trajectories were intricately tied to his survival. They started the Whisper network in the break rooms and over secure messaging applications. The narrative they fed to the board of directors and the internal management team was entirely predictable. They claimed I was a temperamental, rigid control freak who had lost touch with the dynamic needs of a modern corporation. They leaked rumors that I had deliberately engineered a hostage system, weaving my own security credentials so deeply into the platform's code that I made myself impossible to replace. They desperately hoped that if they painted me as a rogue, unstable architect, the board would be too terrified of my power to back me. Human Resources made their move next. Evelyn, the director who had frozen in her chair during the launch meeting, realized her own severe legal exposure. Desperate to shield herself from the fallout of an illegal, undocumented termination, she quietly circulated a draft separation memo to the internal legal department. The document was a masterpiece of revisionist corporate fiction. It falsely described my removal as the final necessary step in a long-term performance management plan. The memo cited an inability to collaborate, a hostile demeanor, and a chronic refusal to support executive directives. But Evelyn was an administrator, not a forensic auditor. When a paralegal allied with Mara pulled the native file from the secure Human Resources server, the metadata told a completely different, damning story. The digital timestamp embedded in the document proved the memo had been created at 6 a.m. on the day of the launch. They had actively written the justification for my firing 3 hours before Sabrina ever walked into the boardroom and staged her supposedly spontaneous intervention. But the smear campaign ultimately failed to take root, because the ground beneath Adrian's feet was already giving way. The silence I had maintained, the absolute refusal to engage in an emotional public war, gave other people the space to finally speak, and once the fear of Adrian's invincibility broke, too many quiet people started talking. Lila Torres was the first to cross the line formally. She sat in Mara's downtown office, her hands shaking as she held a pen, and signed a sworn affidavit. She agreed to testify on the record that she had been repeatedly instructed to backdate financial approvals. She detailed exactly how Adrian's chief of staff ordered her to recode service descriptions so that the favored vendors connected to Sabrina could clear through the administrative exception lanes without triggering my compliance alarms. Courage is highly contagious in a collapsing regime. 2 days after Lila signed her statement, a junior infrastructure engineer named Thomas requested a secure meeting with the special committee. Thomas was young, ambitious, and terrified, but he knew exactly what he had been asked to do. He admitted that 48 hours before the launch, he had been pulled into a private office by the chief of staff. He heavily pressured me to prepare blank authority transfer paperwork. Thomas confessed to the committee, his voice wavering but resolute. He told me to bypass the secure custodian protocols and leave the destination fields empty. He said it was just a precaution, a necessary backup plan, just in case Kayla became difficult during the system transition. The final fatal blow to Adrian's manufactured narrative came from the very top of the finance division. The head of Treasury, a man named Richard who had spent the last 2 years sweating through executive meetings and signing off on questionable ledgers, finally broke ranks. He requested total immunity from the board in exchange for his hard drives. Richard looked physically ill as he placed his laptop on Naomi Hargrove's desk. He revealed that multiple quarter-end certification packets, the exact legal documents sent to the banks to verify our financial health, contained heavily manipulated numbers. He testified that when he pointed out the glaring discrepancies regarding consulting expenditures, Adrian had pulled him aside. He told me not to question the math, Richard admitted, staring blankly at the wall. He said the company simply needed a smoother lender story to secure the next round of capital, and that I was paid to manage the story, not to audit the chief executive officer. While Adrian was rapidly losing his grip on the internal narrative, Sabrina was actively destroying her own defense on the outside. Furious that her influence was completely slipping and deeply humiliated that security had publicly barred her from the command room, she turned to the only arena she still controlled. She began posting heavily polished, cryptic messages on her social media platforms. She posted aesthetic photos of her private design office, pairing them with long captions about the heavy burden of leadership, protecting the ultimate vision from negativity, and the necessity of removing toxic energy from a growing empire. She thought she was projecting strength and unbothered grace to her followers. In reality, she was publicly documenting her own culpability. Every single post accidentally drew more attention to the undeniable fact that she had acted exactly like a senior executive without ever holding a title, drawing a salary, or signing a basic compliance waiver. I watched them flail, but I strictly chose not to retaliate with emotional theatrics. I did not leak counterstatements to the industry press. I did not post vague, vindictive messages online. Instead, I sat in my temporary office and built a chronology. I laid out a massive timeline across a conference table, mapping every single lie from the Mercer camp against the hard, immutable data of the system logs. They claimed I was insubordinate on Tuesday. I produced a clean audit for Monday showing 0 compliance violations. They claimed Sabrina acted alone. I produced the timestamp of the Human Resources memo. My timeline was so clean, so terrifyingly precise, that every time Adrian or his allies tried to spin a new excuse, they only tightened the legal snare around their own necks. Despite the absolute warfare happening at the executive level, I refused to let the collateral damage spread to the people who actually built the company. During my daily briefing with the board, I pushed Naomi to release the remaining clean payroll and the legitimate small subcontractor payments. The executives who are bleeding this company dry can wait in the dark, I told the committee, sliding the authorization forms across the table. But the innocent workers swinging hammers and pouring foundations are not going to miss their mortgage payments just because their leadership is running a shadow ledger. Authorize the release of $3 million to the regional concrete suppliers and the electrical unions. It was a decision that forced the board to see me not as a vengeful ousted employee seeking retribution, but as the only adult left in the room who actually cared about the survival of the enterprise. It highlighted the sheer difference between my leadership and Adrian's reckless ego. The massive volume of evidence became impossible to contain behind closed doors. The terrified whispers had turned into sworn, documented statements. The digital footprints had solidified into concrete proof of systemic fraud. On a cold Thursday morning, exactly 10 days after I was publicly fired, Naomi Hargrove issued a formal binding directive to every member of the executive team and the monitoring lenders. She bypassed the standard quarterly meeting schedule entirely and called for a full emergency board hearing. The tone of the summons left absolutely no room for negotiation or delay. As the calendar invites landed in the inboxes across the executive floor, the remaining loyalists finally went quiet. The company understood, with absolute clarity, that this crisis was not going to fade away into the shadows. This was not going to end with a quiet, confidential settlement, a generous severance check, and a polite press release about pursuing new opportunities. It was going to end with names, timestamps, and absolute accountability. The emergency hearing convened at 9 o'clock on a Monday morning inside the primary conference center of the lending syndicate's downtown high-rise. It was neutral ground, deliberately chosen by Naomi Hargrove to strip Adrian of his home field advantage. The massive circular table was ringed by the entire board of directors, 3 partners from outside legal counsel, the primary lender's forensic accounting team, and a court reporter recording every single syllable. Adrian Mercer opened his defense not with an apology, but with a calculated offensive strike. He wore a dark navy suit and projected the aggrieved exhaustion of a visionary leader burdened by incompetent subordinates. "We are here today because of a massive architectural failure disguised as compliance," Adrian began, gesturing toward the center of the table. Kayla Mitchell deliberately over-engineered the Ledger One platform out of pure vanity. She built a digital fortress that made her the absolute center of gravity. I asked the board to consider a simple truth. No healthy modern corporation should ever depend on one single person for operational continuity. The system lockdown was a catastrophic design flaw, a hostage mechanism she installed to make herself completely irreplaceable. He leaned back, looking around the room, expecting nods of agreement from the older board members who traditionally favored executive agility over rigid protocol. I sat directly across from him. I did not raise my voice, and I did not let a single trace of anger seep into my tone. The continuity protocol was not a vanity project. Adrian, I explained calmly, looking directly at the board. It was added specifically at the request of this very committee 18 months ago. It was an explicit requirement imposed by our financing partners. I designed the custodian lock for one precise reason: to stop unauthorized executive interference and to prevent hidden payment manipulation during active disbursement cycles. Adrian scoffed, ready to interrupt, but Naomi Hargrove raised her hand, silencing him instantly. She tapped the screen of her tablet. A massive projector illuminated the wall behind Adrian. It displayed a high-resolution scan of the Crescent Harbor System's master governance policy. Naomi highlighted a specific paragraph. It clearly mandated a solitary, verifiable custodian of record to authorize all capital transfers exceeding $100,000, effectively neutralizing the ability of the chief executive officer to unilaterally bypass security. Right beneath that mandate, enlarged for everyone in the room to see, was Adrian's own wet ink signature. He was forced to turn his chair and look at his own signature, validating the exact controls he was currently pretending were the unreasonable actions of a rogue employee. The room remained completely silent as the contradiction hung in the air. Desperate to shift the focus, Sabrina Mercer spoke up. She was seated slightly behind Adrian, no longer commanding the head of a table. Her voice lacked its usual commanding resonance. Instead, it held the fragile edge of a woman realizing her charm had stopped working. "I was only trying to help," Sabrina insisted, looking toward Naomi. "I saw a critical launch being delayed by a negative influence. I was acting to protect the vision of the company from someone who refused to collaborate. It was a stressful morning, and I simply overstepped out of passion for my husband's work." "You did not simply overstep on one stressful morning, Mrs. Mercer," the lead outside counsel replied smoothly. He opened a thick binder. "We have sworn affidavits from 4 separate department heads, 2 executive assistants, and a senior accounts payable manager. They all testify that for the past 10 months, you regularly gave direct orders to staff, negotiated with vendors, and demanded priority queues as though you held formal executive rank." Before Sabrina could formulate a denial, the monitoring lender's forensic team took the floor. The lead auditor did not deal in narratives. She dealt in mathematics. She distributed copies of a devastatingly clean flowchart. "We have completed a preliminary trace of the exception payments flagged by the system hold," the auditor stated flatly. "We found a consistent trail of capital routed through executive bypass lanes. These payments were systematically directed toward entities heavily linked to Sabrina Mercer's private design and events network. Furthermore, the fees were intentionally disguised. They were buried deep inside project support categories, coded as structural, logistics, and community engagement, effectively hiding them from standard quarterly audits." Robert, the internal corporate counsel for Crescent Harbor, had been sitting quietly, staring at his legal pad. Naomi turned to him. "Robert," Naomi said, "for the formal record, did Sabrina Mercer possess any lawful authority to terminate, suspend, or remove Kayla Mitchell from a live financial control cycle?" Robert did not look at Adrian or Sabrina. He looked straight at the court reporter. "Absolutely none. 0 lawful authority existed." The walls were closing in, and Adrian recognized that the narrative of a rogue wife overstepping her bounds was his last remaining lifeboat. He made the brutal calculation to save himself. "I agree with Robert," Adrian said quickly, holding his hands up in a gesture of surrender. Sabrina acted entirely on her own. It was a massive, independent overreaction. I was stunned in that boardroom. I failed to intervene in the moment because I was in shock, but I never authorized the removal. He threw his own wife completely under the bus in front of 20 people. Sabrina snapped her head toward him, her eyes wide with a mixture of absolute betrayal and sudden terror. But Mara Duval, sitting perfectly still next to me, was waiting for exactly this defense. "If you were so stunned by your wife's independent overreaction," Mara asked, her voice ringing clear and sharp, "why did you call my client 45 minutes later to threaten her career?" Mara slid a transcribed copy of the recorded phone call across the table. Naomi read it aloud into the record. She read Adrian's polished menace, his warning that the industry was small, his insistence that difficult people become unemployable, and his attempt to buy my silence with a 6-month severance package in exchange for validating the illegal governance transfer. Adrian's defense of being a shocked, innocent bystander completely collapsed the moment his own post-meeting threats echoed in the sterile room. He had not been stunned. He had been complicit in the cover-up from the very first minute. Then, the final, brutal twist landed. It was a piece of evidence so devastatingly simple that it required no forensic accounting to understand. The lead investigator from outside counsel projected a new document onto the wall. It was an internal calendar invite, pulled from Adrian's deleted items folder. It was dated 4 days before the launch. The invite was sent from Adrian to Sabrina. The subject line read, "Final Ledger 1 Strategy." Attached to the calendar invite was an internal messaging trail between Adrian and his chief of staff. Naomi read the highlighted text aloud. "Kayla is going to block the Maison Aurel invoices again. Have Sabrina attend the final review on Tuesday. Kayla is too proud to make a scene in front of the banking partners. She will be much easier to contain if we embarrass her publicly and force a resignation." The silence that followed was absolute. The document laid everything bare. Sabrina had not crashed the meeting out of spontaneous passion. Adrian had meticulously arranged for her to be there. He had weaponized his wife's arrogance, orchestrating a public humiliation specifically designed to break my composure and remove the only barrier to his fraudulent payment scheme. He tried to use my professionalism against me. He gambled that I would be too polite to fight back in front of the lenders. He was right about my restraint, but catastrophically wrong about what I would do with it. Adrian sat completely motionless. The color had fully drained from his face. He had run out of lies, out of scapegoats, and out of authority. By the time Naomi Hargrove recessed the hearing for a 1-hour deliberation, the entire atmosphere of the crisis had fundamentally shifted. The central question in the room was no longer whether Sabrina Mercer had overstepped her bounds on a Tuesday morning. The board was no longer looking at a human resources disaster. The only question left on the table was how many millions of dollars Adrian Mercer had stolen, and exactly how long he had used his wife as an unofficial instrument of power while lying to his investors about it. The demolition of their story was complete. All that remained was deciding the severity of the sentence. The 1-hour recess felt less like a break and more like the heavy, suffocating calm at the center of a hurricane. When the board of directors finally reconvened in the massive conference room, the atmosphere had turned utterly toxic. Adrian Mercer realized his defense of ignorance had been entirely dismantled. Desperate to regain control of a narrative that was rapidly spiraling into a criminal liability, he launched his final vicious counterattack. He abandoned the story of my incompetence and pivoted directly to accusations of corporate espionage. "This entire proceeding is a farce built on stolen property," Adrian declared, standing up and pointing a trembling finger across the long table toward me. "Kayla Mitchell unlawfully retained proprietary corporate data when she was escorted from the building last week. She is using stolen internal logs to manufacture a baseless conspiracy, hoping to extort a massive financial settlement and distract this board from her own gross insubordination. We are looking at a disgruntled former employee weaponizing proprietary assets." He hoped the threat of a data breach would terrify the board, taint me as an opportunist, and throw a smokescreen over the glaring fraud indicators. It was a classic executive misdirection, but he aimed it at the wrong audience. The lead counsel for the lending syndicate did not even wait for Naomi Hargrove to intervene. He simply adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses, leaned into his microphone, and dismantled Adrian's final defense with ruthless efficiency. "Mr. Mercer," the lender counsel said, his voice dripping with dry condescension. "Miss Mitchell did not steal a single byte of corporate data. The digital records currently projected on that wall, the logs that are hanging you right now, did not come from her personal devices. They were pulled directly from the Neutral Monitoring Archive located on our secure servers in New York. That is the same archive that the Ledger One platform is contractually obligated to update every single night at exactly midnight. Your own signature mandated that specific data mirror to secure our funding. You are quite literally accusing her of stealing the very surveillance tapes you legally agreed to install." Adrian sank slowly back into his leather chair, the fight suddenly draining from his posture as the legal reality crushed him. But Sabrina Mercer was not finished. She clung desperately to the last shred of plausible deniability regarding the fraudulent capital flows. "I have absolutely no ownership stake in Maison Aurel Studio," Sabrina insisted, looking directly at the forensic accounting team with wide, defensive eyes. "It is an independent consulting agency. I simply recommended them because they do excellent, visionary work. You cannot penalize my husband or destroy this company because a vendor I happen to admire won a few contracts." The forensic accountant, a quiet, intensely focused woman who had been typing methodically on her laptop for the past hour, finally looked up. "Mrs. Mercer, corporate ownership is rarely a matter of simple public registration, especially when the money moves in the dark." The accountant clicked a button, and a complex, brightly colored web of financial transactions appeared on the massive projector screen. "While your name does not appear on the limited liability company registration," the accountant explained, tracing the digital lines with a laser pointer, "the payment flows tell a vastly different story. We followed the $50,000 exception payments routed to Maison Aurel over the last 8 months. Within 48 hours of clearing Crescent Harbor's accounts, those exact funds were systematically dispersed to cover overlapping commercial leases at your private office address. We also found direct recurring staff reimbursements flowing from Maison Aurel directly to your personal executive assistant. Finally, a significant portion of the capital was routed into a shell entity responsible for the multi-million-dollar renovation of your primary residence in Aspen. You do not just recommend Maison Aurel, Mrs. Mercer. You are its primary financial beneficiary." Sabrina's mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. The elegant facade she had spent years cultivating was publicly stripped away, leaving nothing but the raw exposure of a petty grifter caught with her hands in the vault. The sheer scale of the entanglement was staggering, and the Human Resources Department could no longer hide behind ignorance. Naomi turned her attention to Evelyn, the director of Human Resources, who was sweating profusely under the harsh fluorescent lights. "Evelyn," Naomi demanded, her voice echoing with measured authority, "under formal questioning, you must answer. How long has Sabrina Mercer possessed unauthorized access to internal personnel files?" Evelyn cracked instantly, knowing her own legal immunity depended on total cooperation. 6 months, she whispered, her voice trembling. She started using Adrian's executive assistants to pull confidential schedules. She wanted to know who was in the office, who was traveling, and who was questioning the rapid vendor approvals. She even had the assistants draft preliminary disciplinary materials for employees she felt were not aligned with her vision. It was a shadow human resources department. The governance scandal had officially widened far beyond my isolated firing. Sabrina had been operating an unauthorized surveillance state within the company to protect her revenue streams. A former vendor relationship director, who had resigned quietly 3 months prior, was brought into the hearing via a secure video link. He corroborated Evelyn's confession with brutal clarity. "Sabrina regularly bypassed the procurement queue," the former director testified, his face stern on the monitor. "She demanded accelerated payment treatment for specific firms. When I looked into those firms, they were always entities that sponsored her private charity galas or handled luxury logistics for her personal brand. If I pushed back or asked for secondary signatures, Adrian would call me into his office the next day and tell me I was standing in the way of critical strategic partnerships. But the absolute worst revelation, the one that turned a massive ethical breach into a federal crime, came from the Treasury Department. The internal auditors had spent the recess digging deeper into the specific accounts I had frozen. Richard, the head of Treasury, placed a thick stack of printed invoices onto the center of the table. He looked physically ill. "We found the camouflage." "Explain the methodology," Naomi ordered. They knew Kayla's system would eventually flag the constant, isolated exception payments to boutique consultants, Richard explained, wiping his forehead with a handkerchief. So they started piggybacking the fraudulent duplicate charges onto legitimate construction invoices. We have real, hard-working contractors pouring concrete and laying foundation who submitted valid bills for $200,000. Adrian's office would intercept those invoices, inflate them by $30,000 or $40,000 under the guise of site consulting fees, and force them through the system. They used our legitimate subcontractors as a Trojan horse to divert capital. The construction firms had absolutely no idea their tax identification numbers were being leveraged to shield illicit corporate disbursements. The room erupted in a low, dangerous murmur. Legitimate firms were being used as camouflage for inflated and diverted payments. This was wire fraud, deeply embedded within the operational lifeblood of the infrastructure projects. Cornered, stripped of his technical defenses, and exposed before his largest investors, Adrian attempted one last desperate emotional pivot. He turned his chair to face me directly, his eyes wide, his face flushed with a mixture of rage and terror. "You are enjoying this spectacle, are you not?" Adrian hissed, abandoning all professional decorum. "You sat there for years, quietly judging us, waiting for the perfect moment to build your little guillotine. You knew exactly what the system would do when you walked out that door. This is not about corporate compliance for you, Kayla. This is pure, vindictive revenge because my wife hurt your feelings in front of your colleagues." He wanted me to scream. He wanted me to act like the difficult, temperamental woman they had painted me to be. But I offered him nothing but absolute, freezing stillness. I did not need to defend my emotions to a thief. Before I could even form a response, Naomi Hargrove brought her heavy wooden gavel down onto the desk with a sharp, echoing crack. "Mr. Mercer, you will stop speaking immediately," Naomi ordered, her voice cutting through his outburst like a razor. "This board of directors is looking at a massive trail of falsified documents, misappropriated funds, and breached covenants. We are looking at hard, verifiable evidence of systemic fraud. We are absolutely not interested in your wounded ego or your wife's feelings." Naomi looked at the outside legal counsel, exchanging a silent, grave nod. The special committee paused the interrogation. The silence in the room was not the result of a weak case. It was the heavy, suffocating silence of a trap fully snapping shut. The findings had crossed a terrifying threshold. The evidence was now so severe, so undeniably documented, that it triggered mandatory outside recovery actions. The board was now legally obligated to make formal referrals to federal regulatory agencies and law enforcement. Adrian and Sabrina sat shoulder to shoulder at the table. Yet they looked miles apart. The reality of their situation had finally breached their polished delusions. They were no longer the untouchable power couple dictating the future of the enterprise. They were suspects. Yet, incredibly, I could still see the gears turning in Adrian's eyes. He was a man accustomed to buying his way out of consequences. He still harbored a fragile, desperate hope that they could negotiate a quiet exit, offer a massive financial restitution, and walk away before the authorities arrived. Naomi stood up, gathering her thick folders of evidence. She looked down at the two of them with absolute, clinical detachment. "The special committee has heard enough for today," Naomi announced, her voice echoing with finality in the cavernous room. "We are adjourning this hearing to finalize our legal obligations and notify the appropriate authorities. Adrian, you and Sabrina will surrender your corporate devices and your building access passes immediately. The full board of directors will reconvene to deliver our final resolutions tomorrow morning, exactly 1 hour before the market opens." The Tuesday morning air was brittle and freezing as I walked into the Crescent Harbor Systems building for the final time as a temporary consultant. It was exactly 7 in the morning, 1 hour before the financial markets opened in New York. The boardroom on the executive floor was already full, but the dynamic had completely inverted since the day I was fired. Adrian and Sabrina sat at the far end of the long mahogany table, isolated, stripped of their usual entourage of nodding vice presidents and terrified administrative assistants. Naomi Hargrove stood at the head of the table. She did not sit down. She opened a thick, leather-bound dossier and began laying out the full investigative findings in language so blunt it felt like physical blows. "The special committee has concluded its comprehensive review," Naomi announced, her voice echoing off the glass walls. "The evidence confirms unauthorized spousal interference in corporate operations. It confirms the retaliatory, public removal of a legally mandated control custodian during a live financial cycle. It confirms deliberate, false statements made to our lending partners. Furthermore, we have irrefutable proof of improper vendor favoritism, fraudulent invoice manipulation, and attempted post-crisis concealment." The silence that followed was absolute, but it lasted only a few seconds before the Mercer United Front violently collapsed. Adrian, realizing that decades of executive privilege were evaporating before his eyes, turned entirely on the woman sitting next to him. "I did not manipulate those invoices," Adrian hissed, his voice cracking with panic as he glared at Sabrina. "You acted recklessly. You brought your private vendors into our infrastructure projects. You played executive and you ruined absolutely everything." Sabrina recoiled, her elegant posture shattering into raw, desperate fury. "How dare you?" she fired back, her voice rising to a shrill pitch. "You let me believe I had the authority. You stood there in that room and let me fire her because you were too much of a coward to do it yourself. You signed those exception forms. You told me exactly which accounts were vulnerable." It was a stunning, pathetic display of mutual betrayal. They were no longer the masterminds of a corporate empire. They were two cornered thieves, desperately trying to hand the board a different scapegoat. But watching them tear each other apart in real time only provided the board of directors with the final, visceral confirmation of their absolute guilt. Naomi did not even ask them to stop arguing. She simply raised a hand, and the outside legal counsel distributed the final resolutions. "The board of directors has voted unanimously," Naomi stated, her tone devoid of any sympathy. "Adrian Mercer, your employment as Chief Executive Officer is terminated for cause, effective immediately. All pending executive compensation, including your unvested stock options and severance guarantees, are permanently canceled. Furthermore, the board has authorized comprehensive civil recovery actions against you to reclaim the misappropriated funds tied to the suspect payments and the false lender certifications." Naomi then turned her cold gaze toward Sabrina. "Sabrina Mercer, you are formally barred from all Crescent Harbor Systems properties. You are named directly as a co-defendant in the civil recovery actions. Every unofficial privilege, every vendor contact, and every access badge you utilize to play executive from the shadows has been permanently revoked. Security will escort both of you out of the building." I sat silently near the middle of the table, the exact spot where I had placed my badge down weeks ago. I watched as two large security officers stepped forward. Adrian looked completely hollowed out, staring blankly at the polished wood. Sabrina tried to maintain her chin high, but her hands were visibly trembling as she gathered her designer coat. They were marched out of the room, out of the executive suite, and out of the empire they thought they owned. Once the heavy oak doors closed, Naomi walked over to my side of the table. The tension in the room broke, replaced by the crisp, urgent reality of a corporation that still needed to function. "The rot is gone," Naomi said softly. "Now we have to fix the house." "What do you need to restore the primary payment pipelines?" "I need a formally documented lawful authority structure installed into the system," I replied, opening my laptop. "I need outside oversight written directly into the approval process for any transaction exceeding $100,000. And I need the board's written mandate that all suspect vendor streams linked to Maison Aurel will remain permanently locked for the duration of the federal investigation." "You have it?" Naomi agreed instantly. She slid a single, crisp sheet of paper across the table. It was not a technical mandate. It was an employment contract. "The board is restructuring the executive hierarchy. We do not want you reporting to the next chief executive officer. We want you reporting directly to us. We are offering you the position of Chief Governance and Controls Officer." I looked at the title. It was a massive elevation, a role that possessed absolute veto power over corporate capital. It made me harder to sideline than ever again. They could never stage another public firing because my authority would be hard-coded into the corporate charter. I will accept, I told Naomi, meeting her gaze, but on my own terms. I want ironclad, written legal protections and absolute immunity guarantees for Lila Torres in accounts payable, Richard in treasury, Thomas in engineering, and every other junior staff member who was pressured into silence by Adrian's administration. They risked their livelihoods to tell the truth. They will not be punished for the sins of the executive floor. Naomi smiled, a genuine expression of profound respect. Draft the addendum. I will sign it myself. That condition made the victory feel completely different. It was not just a strategic triumph over two corrupt individuals. It was a moral restoration for the people who actually kept the company running. By noon, a company-wide internal memo was broadcast to all 3,000 employees across North America. It officially announced the immediate leadership change, the sweeping governance reforms, and my new role. The memo used careful, legally approved language, but the subtext was crystal clear to everyone reading it. The employees finally understood that the catastrophic crisis was never caused by one difficult woman who refused to collaborate. It was caused by arrogant executives who mistook their proximity to power for actual, functional authority. The myth they tried to build around my name was shattered forever. Late that afternoon, the executive floor was quiet. I walked into the central command room alone. The massive digital map of North America dominated the front wall, tracking the financial heartbeat of our 18 commercial development projects. I sat down at the primary terminal, authenticated my new security credentials, and initiated the final release sequence for the verified, clean capital. I watched as the complex payment grid above me slowly came back to life. A wave of solid, glowing green lights washed across the map, illuminating the transit hubs in Denver, the high-rises in Chicago, and the massive infrastructure projects in Seattle. The money was moving again, clean and undeniable. I leaned back in the heavy leather chair, listening to the quiet hum of the servers. They had truly believed that humiliating me in front of lenders and executives would make me disappear into the shadows. They thought they could simply erase me publicly and take the keys to the vault. But instead of quietly fading away, I held my ground, and in doing so, I exposed every single hidden line of corruption they never expected anyone to follow. I built a system that obeyed the truth, and the truth had finally set the record straight. Thank you so much for listening to this story, and please comment below to let me know where you are listening from so we can interact and share our thoughts together. I invite you to subscribe to the Boss Revenge Stories channel, like this video, and support us further by pressing the hype button so the story in this video can be heard by many more people.